The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I was already awake, drinking my second cup of coffee and watching the snow fall outside my kitchen window in Toronto. My phone showed my brother's name, Glenn. We had not spoken for 3 weeks, not since our last tense visit to our mother's nursing home. "Douglas," he said, and his voice had a fake calmness that made me uneasy. "I have some difficult news. Mom passed away last night, peacefully in her sleep." I put my coffee mug down, my hands suddenly shaking. "What? When?" "I was planning to visit her today." "The funeral is Friday," he said, cutting me off. His voice became cold and businesslike. "I've already made the arrangements. And Douglas, about Mom's estate, the will is very clear. Everything goes to me. The house, the cottage in Muskoka, her investments, all of it. You get nothing. Don't even think about contesting it." Then he hung up. I stood in my kitchen, staring at my phone in shock. My mother was gone, just like that, and Glenn's first concern was telling me I would get nothing. Not an apology, not comfort, just a warning. Something felt very wrong. My name is Douglas Harrison. I am 64 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 40 years designing infrastructure across Ontario. My wife, Catherine, died 3 years ago from cancer. We had one daughter, Emma, who is now 28 and works as a marine biologist in Vancouver. After Catherine died, I focused on volunteering and spending time with my mother, who supported me through my grief. My brother Glenn is 4 years younger than me. We were close as kids, playing hockey in the driveway of our old house in North York, but as adults we grew apart. Glenn became a real estate agent, married Patricia, and had 2 children. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but over the years I noticed things. Glenn was always chasing big deals and struggling financially. His business had problems, and there were quiet talks at family dinners about bad investments and Patricia working extra shifts as a nurse to support the family. Our mother, Helen Harrison, was 85 and had been sharp her whole life. She was a retired school teacher who could still recite poetry from memory and beat anyone at Scrabble. She lived on her own in her house in Richmond Hill until about 9 months ago, when Glenn convinced her she needed extra help. He suggested becoming her power of attorney to handle her bills and medical appointments. Mom was unsure, but Glenn kept pushing. He was her youngest son, after all. That was when everything changed. Within weeks of Glenn getting power of attorney, Mom was suddenly diagnosed with severe dementia. Glenn moved her into a nursing home called Maple Grove Care Center, saying she could no longer live alone. When I visited her, I was shocked. My lively, witty mother sat staring into space. She did not recognize me and barely spoke. When she did, her words were confused and broken. I asked her doctor, Dr. James Whitmore, if this was really possible, because she had been fine just 2 months earlier. He said dementia can progress very quickly in some elderly patients, but it did not feel right to me. I still visited Mom 3 times a week. Even when she did not know who I was, I held her hand and talked about Emma and my volunteer work. Glenn visited too, but not often, and he always seemed rushed and kept checking his watch. Standing in my kitchen after Glenn's call, I finally understood what I had been ignoring. This was not grief. It was greed. I called Maple Grove Care Center right away and said I had heard my mother passed away. After a pause, the nurse told me there was no record of that and checked her room. My heart was pounding. A few minutes later, she came back and said my mother was fine and eating breakfast. I asked her not to tell anyone I had called, especially my brother, and then hung up. I immediately called my daughter Emma. She answered, worried, and I told her that Glenn said Grandma had died, but she was still alive. I said I believed Glenn was trying to steal her estate. Emma said that was elder abuse and fraud and asked what I was going to do. I told her I did not know yet, but I had to act fast. Glenn had said the funeral was Friday, only 3 days away. After speaking with Emma, I spent the rest of the morning making calls. First, I contacted a lawyer I had worked with before on a construction contract dispute. His name was Robert Chen. I explained everything to him. He said, "Douglas, this is very serious. If your brother has power of attorney and is lying about your mother's condition or stealing her assets, this could lead to criminal charges. But you will need strong evidence." Next, I hired a private investigator named Sarah Mitchell. She came to my house that afternoon. She was in her mid-40s, sharp and focused, with grey streaks in her dark hair. She asked how long my brother had power of attorney. I told her it had been about 9 months, right after Mom suddenly developed dementia, even though she had been fully capable before that. She had been volunteering at the library and playing bridge twice a week, and then suddenly she could not remember her own name. Sarah nodded and said she had seen cases like this before. She told me to give her 48 hours to look into my mother's finances. That evening, I drove to Maple Grove without telling anyone. When I entered Mom's room, she was sitting in her usual chair by the window, looking out at the dark sky. Her hair was thinner and her face more lined, but she seemed different that night. She looked less drugged and more aware. I sat beside her and softly said her name and told her I was her son, Douglas. She turned toward me and looked into my eyes. For a moment, it felt like she recognized me. Her lips moved as if she wanted to speak, but then a nurse came in to check her vitals, and the moment passed. I drove home through the snow, my thoughts racing. I wondered what Glenn was planning. A fake funeral to make everyone believe Mom was dead? Then quietly transfer all her assets. It sounded insane, but also frighteningly clever. The next morning, Sarah called me and told me to sit down. She said my brother had been very active. Over the past 8 months, he had transferred about $280,000 from my mother's accounts into his own. He had sold her cottage in Muskoka to a numbered company that Sarah believed he controlled. He had also been using her credit cards. Then she told me something worse. The doctor who diagnosed Mom's dementia, Dr. James Whitmore, had been friends with Glenn for over 30 years. They had gone to university together. I felt sick. Sarah explained that Mom's condition could be caused by medication. If she was being given too many sedatives or antipsychotics, it would explain her sudden mental decline and empty behavior. She said this could amount to attempted murder, but it would have to be proven. She was working on getting Mom's medical records, but that would take time. She advised me to visit my mother again, document everything, and record any conversations with Glenn if possible, since Ontario allows one-party consent. That afternoon, I returned to Maple Grove. I had my phone with me, ready to record anything suspicious, but when I reached Mom's room, it was empty. A nurse I did not recognize was changing the sheets. I asked where my mother was, panic rising in my chest. The nurse said my brother had taken her out for a drive because he thought she needed fresh air. My blood ran cold. I asked when they left, and she said about an hour earlier. I rushed to the parking lot, but Glenn's black Mercedes was already gone. I called him again and again, but he did not answer. 3 hours later, they finally returned. Glenn helped Mom out of the car as she slowly shuffled back toward her room. She looked exhausted and confused. Glenn noticed me standing in the hallway and spoke with clear annoyance, asking what I was doing there. I reminded him that he had told me yesterday that Mom was dead, yet here she was. He laughed and said it was just a misunderstanding, claiming Mom had a bad episode and that these things happen with dementia. I asked where he had taken her, and he said it was just a drive. I pointed out that she could barely stand. His voice turned cold as he told me to back off and reminded me that he was her power of attorney and made the decisions, not me. He told me to get a lawyer if I wanted to challenge that. He then brushed past me and helped Mom into her room, speaking to her quietly before leaving without looking at me. As I was about to leave, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but I answered. At first there was silence, then a faint woman's whisper said my name. I asked who it was, and the voice said it was my mother. I froze. That made no sense because she was right there in her room. I checked my phone and saw the number was blocked. She told me to listen carefully and said I needed to come to her room late that night, after 10, and make sure Glenn was not there. She warned me not to tell anyone about the call, and then the line went dead. I stood in the parking lot as snow fell around me, staring at my phone in shock. It felt impossible. Mom could barely speak, yet that voice sounded like the real her, clear and strong. I waited in my car until after 10, watching the nursing home. Glenn's car was gone, and only the night staff was there. I used my key code to enter through the side door and went to Mom's room. She was sitting up in bed with the lights low. When I walked in, she looked at me, and her eyes were clear and focused. She told me to close the door, speaking in a normal, steady voice, not the confused tone I had heard for months. A normal, strong voice. I closed the door, my hands shaking. She told me to sit down because we did not have much time. I sat there in shock and asked if she was really okay and what was happening. My mother, whom I believed was lost to dementia, smiled at me, the same knowing smile she used when we were children and got caught sneaking cookies. She said she was fine and had been fine the whole time. She told me the dementia was fake and that she had been pretending. The room felt like it was spinning. She held my hand, and her grip was strong and steady, nothing like the weak hands I had held for months. She explained that at 85, she had been thinking about death and wanted to know which of her sons would truly care for her, not for money or inheritance, but out of love. When Glenn suggested becoming her power of attorney, she agreed and used it as a test. At the same time, she hired her own lawyer without Glenn knowing and moved most of her assets into an irrevocable trust before he got power of attorney. She only left limited access to see what he would do. I asked why she did not tell me, and her eyes filled with sadness. She said she had to test both of us and see who would still visit her and care for her when she had nothing to give. She told me I came 3 times a week, sat with her, and spoke to her even when she pretended not to know me. I was crying and told her of course I came because she was my mother. She said Glenn had failed badly and that she had been recording everything, including him pressuring her to sign papers, getting angry, and stealing from her room. She said she allowed him to take the $280,000 from the accounts on purpose so he would expose himself. I told her Glenn had said she was dead and was planning a funeral. She said she knew and that he had told her she would have an accident and die peacefully after signing papers, which she refused to do. I said this was dangerous and that we should call the police, but she told me not yet. She said Robert Chen was her lawyer too and that there was a plan. I agreed to trust her. Over the next 2 days, we prepared everything. The police were involved quietly, hidden cameras were placed in her room, and trusted nursing home staff helped set everything up to catch Glenn with clear evidence. Mom continued pretending to be confused whenever Glenn was around. He visited twice more. The first time, he brought papers for her to sign to transfer her house. Mom scribbled something unclear and acted like she did not understand. Glenn was clearly frustrated and told her to sign properly, saying he was trying to help her. The second visit was Thursday night, and he brought a syringe. Later, when I watched the video footage, it made me sick. He told Mom it was her medication, but tests later showed it was a huge dose of sedatives, enough to heavily drug someone. Mom pretended to take it but secretly hid the pills. Glenn smoothed her hair and said that tomorrow she would finally be at peace. Friday morning arrived, and Glenn had already booked the funeral home, informed relatives, and spread the news of Mom's death. Family members called me with condolences, and I played along, confirming the funeral time. The funeral home was full, decorated with flowers and a large photo of Mom from years earlier. Glenn had even written an emotional obituary. I sat in the front row with Emma, who had flown in that morning. Glenn sat across from us with his wife and children, looking calm and sad. At exactly 2 p.m., Glenn stood up to give the eulogy and spoke about Mom's life, her career, and how she trusted him in her final months. He claimed she loved him the most and wanted him to have everything because she trusted him. That was when I stood up and loudly asked him to tell everyone where Mom really was. The room filled with confusion, and Glenn's face turned pale as he told me to sit down. "This isn't the time," Glenn said. I looked at him and asked where Mom's body was. He said she was being cremated and that we had already discussed it. I told him I had called the crematorium and they did not have her. Patricia grabbed his arm and asked what I was talking about. At that moment, the doors at the back of the funeral home opened. Everyone turned to look. My mother stood in the doorway, using a walker but standing tall, her eyes clear and sharp. 2 uniformed police officers followed her inside. The room erupted in shock. People stood up, gasped, and cried. Glenn's daughter burst into tears. Mom walked slowly down the aisle and stopped in front of Glenn. She greeted him and said she was not dead, but his inheritance was. Glenn tried to say she was confused and sick, but she calmly told him she was not confused and that she had been recording everything for the past 8 months. She listed his threats, his theft, the pressure to sign documents, and the times he drugged her. She apologized to everyone for the deception and said she had needed to know what her son would do when he thought she was helpless. One of the officers stepped forward and arrested Glenn for elder abuse, theft, fraud, and attempted probate fraud. Glenn tried to run but was quickly tackled and handcuffed. His children cried, and Patricia stood frozen in shock. As Glenn was led away, he shouted that he needed the money. Mom watched him go, crying, but said he stopped being her child the moment he decided her life was worth less than her money. The legal process took months. Glenn tried to fight the charges by claiming Mom was incompetent and that he was helping her, but the evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Whitmore later testified after being given immunity, admitting that Glenn had pressured him to prescribe unnecessary and dangerous medications. In the end, Glenn pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, ordered to repay the $280,000 he had stolen, and fined an additional $50,000. He permanently lost his real estate license. Patricia divorced him and was granted full custody of the children. They were deeply hurt by everything, but Emma and I stayed involved in their lives and tried to give them stability. Dr. Whitmore also lost his medical license for knowingly prescribing harmful medication to an elderly patient without proper evaluation. The medical board showed no mercy. Mom later moved into a small condo near my home. She was done with managing a large house and wanted to be close to family. We had dinner together twice a week, and she began volunteering again, this time at an elder abuse prevention center, sharing her experience to help others. We also created the Helen Harrison Elder Protection Fund, using part of the recovered money to help seniors facing financial abuse and to educate people about power of attorney responsibilities. About a year later, Mom and I sat on my porch watching the snow fall. She held a cup of tea and I asked if she ever regretted testing us. After a long pause, she said she regretted that it was necessary and that her own son could betray her, but she did not regret learning the truth. She said she needed to know who would love her when she had nothing to give, and I had shown her that. I told her she had taught me integrity and the importance of doing the right thing even when it is hard. She smiled and said I passed the test not just because I visited her, but because even when I believed she was gone and I would gain nothing, I still fought for what was right and protected her. She said real family is not made by blood, but by love, choice, and showing up. Glenn was my blood, but he stopped being family the moment he decided I was just something to sell for money. We sat quietly, watching the snow gather on the fence and the bare trees. Inside the house, my phone kept buzzing, probably Emma calling from Vancouver or Mom's lawyer with updates about the charity fund. Life was moving on. Mom looked at me with her sharp, clear eyes and said the saddest part was that if Glenn had just asked for help and been honest about his money problems, she would have helped him. Not blindly, but in a healthy way. Instead, he chose to steal and treated her like she was already dead, and that choice cost him everything. I had no words, so I held her hand. She had shown more strength and dignity in the past year than I had seen in all the years before. She survived betrayal by her own son, saved herself, and chose to help others afterward. Real family is not about blood or inheritance. It is about showing up, loving someone when they have nothing to give, and doing what is right even when it means standing against your own brother. Glenn chose greed over love and theft over integrity, and he paid the price by losing his family, his career, his children's respect, and his mother's love. I gained something far more valuable than money. I gained more real years with my mother, time to talk, laugh, and heal. I learned that I did the right thing when it mattered, and I became part of helping others avoid the same pain. Blood does not excuse betrayal. True family protects the weak. Sometimes the bravest thing an 85-year-old woman can do is pretend to be helpless to learn who will stand by her. That is what my mother taught me, that dignity matters more than money, and real love shows up even when there is nothing to gain.